there must be many other generals and other people in the Kremlin war machine responsible for other human rights atrocities and war crimes and so on, who will be feeling rather nervous about coming out of their houses in the morning for fear that they may meet an untimely end as well.
Let's look at events in Moscow. Ukraine has claimed the death of a senior Russian general who was killed by a remote control bomb attached to a scooter. Igor Kirillov was accused yesterday by Ukraine of authorising the use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. Meanwhile, MPs will tomorrow consider a bill which could enable the transfer of frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. Edward Lucas is a Times columnist specialising in European and transatlantic security, and Edward joins me now. So, Edward, Kirillov is the most prominent military officer to be assassinated since Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So how do you think the Kremlin are going to respond to this development?
Well, they're publicly furious, and I suspect they're privately rather worried. This shows, again, that Ukrainians can operate deep inside Russia, in the heart of Moscow, precisely and lethally. And there must be many other generals and other people in the Kremlin war machine responsible for other human rights atrocities and war crimes and so on, who will be feeling rather nervous about coming out of their houses in the morning for fear that they may meet an untimely end as well.
He was sanctioned by Britain in October for overseeing what was described as the cruel and inhumane use of chemical weapons in Ukraine and acting as a significant mouthpiece for Kremlin disinformation. So do you think these sanctions have had any effect?
Well, I don't think that it's the British sanctions which have had any effect. Our sanctions generally have been throwing a bit of sand in the wheels for the Kremlin's attack on Ukraine, but I don't think they've been decisive, because clearly the attack is continuing and the Russian forces are moving forward. I think it adds a sort of extra detail, the fact that it wasn't just the Ukrainians saying this man was responsible for using chemical weapons, which have been used repeatedly by the Russians in their offensive. But we've agreed that's true. But I think Ukraine is increasingly becoming a bit more like Israel. It decides on its own what it needs to do, and then goes ahead and does it. And they're fairly impatient with Western allies who urge caution and don't actually deliver when it comes to providing assistance.
And you wrote a really great piece yesterday in the Times arguing that if UK sanctions were working, Russia wouldn't actually be grinding forwards in Ukraine in the way that it has done. It would actually already have lost. So what more do you think the UK could and should be doing here?
Well, there's a huge amount that all Western countries could be doing. My piece in particular was looking at the case of the Russian central bank assets, which were frozen at the beginning of the war, roughly $300 billion worth. And a brilliant Ukrainian-American lawyer and colleagues have tracked down 27 billion, which they think is in UK bank accounts. And we've been trying to get a cross-party coalition of MPs to push an amendment to a bill that is going through Parliament at the moment to say that these central bank assets shouldn't just be frozen, they should be seized, and the money should go to Ukraine. And we haven't succeeded so far. There was a debate on Wednesday. The government hasn't accepted this amendment for debate, although they have accepted a rather more modest one, which just urges them to keep tabs on the issue and report on how they're doing. So we'll come back for a second bite on this when the bill goes to the House of Lords. And we hope that maybe public pressure will have increased on the government to the point that their spine becomes a bit stiffer. But in general, our record is lamentable on this. We, Chelsea football fans, and indeed those who don't like Chelsea Football Club, will remember that at the start of the war, Roman Abramovich, the owner of Chelsea, was forced to sell it, with the money, 2.5 billion, going into a trust for victims of the war. And you might reasonably assume that that money would have been long since spent. In fact, not a penny has been spent, because the whole thing is tied up in discussions with Abramovich's lawyers. And so, although the government promises relentless pressure and as long as it takes and all these wonderful phrases, I'm afraid when it comes to reality rather than rhetoric, Britain's record is actually pretty weak.
So it's all talk and no action at the moment. So just finally, Edward, tomorrow MPs will have what may be their last chance to nudge the government into action and give up to £27 billion in frozen Russian assets to Ukraine. Can you tell us why that matters?
Well, as I said, the government hasn't accepted that amendment for debate, so we've missed the chance on that this time round. And there's a more modest amendment which has been selected, and we hope that that will go through. But that just mandates the government to keep us updated on how they're doing on disbursement of funds to Ukraine and discussions with other countries about those frozen assets. But this is a very large lump of Russian money sitting abroad. And thanks to my former journalistic colleague and then Canadian Foreign Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, the G7 moved very quickly at the start of the war to freeze that. And that was a big blow to Russia. They weren't expecting that. But since then, we haven't done anything. The interest on this money is being dribbled out to support Ukraine. But under international law, Russia is liable for the damages it's done to Ukraine. And the best way to pay those damages would be to seize this money and either give it directly to Ukraine or borrow against it and donate that money. But as I speak, as we listen to this program, Ukraine is bleeding to death. They are running out of soldiers. Their infrastructure is being pummeled. They're coming out with stunningly successful long-range operations like the one we discussed at the beginning of this interview, but it's not enough. And if we don't do something, Ukraine will lose, and we'll then face millions of refugees, and we'll see Russia coming back for second helpings, either in Ukraine again or attacking one of the frontline states in NATO. And we are not ready for this war. So it's very much in our interest that we do everything we can right now to make sure that Russia loses the war and that Ukraine wins it. And I really hope that our MPs and peers will take that on board.
We will keep an eye on those developments tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me. That's Edward Lucas, the Times columnist.
Ukraine assassinated a top Russian general it accused of chemical weapons crimes in Moscow on Tuesday morning. A source from Ukraine's SBU has confirmed the intelligence service was responsible. It marks the most high-profile killing of its kind. Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, who was chief of Russia's nuclear, biological and chemical protection troops, was killed outside an apartment building when a bomb hidden in an electric scooter went off. That's according to Russia's investigative committee, which investigates serious crimes, adding that his assistant also died in the blast. A local resident was near the explosion.
At first we thought that cement might have been unloaded or something similar, but the blast was so loud that it did not seem like construction works. It was very scary.
Kirillov is the most senior Russian military officer to be assassinated inside Russia by Ukraine. Russia's state RIA news agency cited former President Dmitry Medvedev, saying Ukraine now faces imminent revenge. Investigators said they had opened a criminal case into the murder of 2 servicemen. Law enforcement sources told Russian media a terrorism case was likely to be opened.